I would like now to give the floor to Didier Millerot to really look on what the Commission wanted to achieve when they started and how he sees the final product that is now available for the member states. So, Didier, the floor is yours. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for coming to this session and for showing some interest in the new EU directive on accounting. It's called the Accounting Directive in our jargon, and this is going to be the main topic of my presentation. So, as Peter said, I'm the head of the accounting department in the Commission. So our job is to prepare, negotiate, and then to enforce or to ensure that the new or the existing EU legislation on accounting and financial reporting is properly enforced by the member states and by the companies concerned. This is an EU job, so we are not necessarily, as you may know, doing all the legislation which is enforced in the 28 member states of the European Union. Our job is just to adopt rules when there is a need for harmonization, when there is a need for having a common basis. And in this respect, our key objective is to make this single market work. It's to make sure that companies within this single market present their financial statement in a way which is understandable across borders. So this is why we need a single or a harmonized accounting language, which is then, let's say, adapted to the needs of the companies. Now you can see on this first slide that we have an approach which varies according to the size and the type of the companies we're talking about. As you can see on this slide, we have for the big 8,000 listed companies in the EU decided to apply IFRS. And for that purpose, we have the IS regulation, which has been adopted in 2002, and which is a very, because we apply IFRS, very detailed and exhaustive piece of legislation. Beyond that, beyond the application of the IFRS for the non-listed companies, there we apply the so-called accounting directive, which is a less detailed piece of legislation because it basically sets principles and leaves some kinds of margin of maneuver to member states. But within that directive, there is also a distinction between different types of company. We have more requirements for the big ones compared to the small ones, and different levels of harmonizations depending on the size of the companies as well. So we apply the so-called principle of subsidiarity, so we only intervene when is needed, and we harmonize as much as we need when there is a need to ensure the proper functioning of the single market. So, talking about harmonizing rules in a single market, we've been dealing with accounting rules already for a long time. The first accounting directives in the EU were adopted in the 70s and in the 80s. You may have heard of the so-called 4th and 7th directive, which are the first piece of legislation in this respect, both on annual financial statement and consolidated financial statements. So since that period, since that time, we have been amending these rules on several occasions, which has meant that the EU legislation became very difficult to read, because in order to have a comprehensive look at it, you need to look at several pieces of legislation. So this is one of the things which we have done with the new directive, which is to bring everything together in one single text. But traditionally, this legislation does the following things. It contains general provisions on how to prepare, publish, audit annual financial statements. It defines the content and function of a management report, establish the way balance sheets and profit and loss accounts have to be prepared in order for them to be easily comparable between different EU companies. There are also evaluate assets and so on, and defines which notes need to be attached to the financial statements. So this is the purpose of these EU legislation in general. Now, what did we want to do? And this is the main topic of today, with the new proposal which we have made in 2009 and finally agreed in 2013. There were 4 big objectives. The first one was, as I said, to make the EU legislation more accessible, so to merge the different texts that have been accumulated across the years and to put them in one single document. And this is something which we achieved because we have now one new directive, the 2034/13 new accounting directive. That was the first objective. The second objective was to put together a different system of distinction between the types of companies. We have now a system that has, for each company, according to its size, a specifically an adapted set of rules. So we have to define what a micro company is, what a small company is, medium size, large, and we also have introduced this notion of public interest entities for which there are some specific, let's say, reporting requirements. So when you look at the directive, you will see that you have different provisions applying depending on the size of the company. And this was also useful for us to be able to achieve our third objective, which is to make sure that for the small firms, we have, let's say, a reduction of the administrative burden which is imposed on these companies in respect of their accounting obligation. This is probably something which we're going to debate this morning, but the idea was to make sure that member states, when they impose transparency and accounting requirements on the small firms, do not go too far in terms of asking information or asking notes which are not necessarily useful or important, with a view to reduce the cost for companies to prepare these accounts. And the last objective which we wanted to achieve was to, let's say, ensure a highest degree of convergence and harmonization between the different rules imposed by member states. This applies to the different size of companies, not only the small ones. In the previous legal environment, there were a lot of so-called options for member states, meaning that dealing with a particular issue, often there was not a single rule applying to the 28 member states, but often there was possibility for the member states to depart from the EU rules, so-called options, which obviously has a consequence on the level of harmonization and comparability of the financial statements produced by companies. So this was the fourth objective. So our motto was simplification, comparability, and clarity. We discussed this with our legislators, the Parliament and Council, for quite some time. It's always quite a long way to go through the EU legislative process. So what did we achieve? We achieved this, as I said, the objective of merging legislation. We have a single directive now. We also managed to get these definitions of what a micro, a small, large, and so on companies are. We also, that's very important, managed to have member states agree on a harmonized regime for small firms. We can come back to this if you want later. But we kind of failed in terms of option reduction, because when you look at the directive, there are still a lot of possibilities for member states to depart from the, let's say, the general rule. So you will see on this slide, I don't have much time, but the key characteristic of what we call the small and micro undertakings regimes. So the key message is simplification of the rules, a reduction of the reporting requirement, and harmonization, with a, let's say, common definition of what these small and micro undertakings are. Maybe a point on micro undertakings. So these are very small companies, less than 10 employees, so whose really capacity to produce financial statements are by definition reduced. Here, this is not a compulsory regime which we have put in place, but it's an option for member states to depart from the small undertaking regime if they wish so. And it's also some kind of menu list, so they can choose what kind of simplification they are happy with in order to simplify the life of these micro undertakings. This slide refers to the number of nodes which we have managed to reduce regarding small firms. You can see that we had 24 in the previous text, and we went to 13 to the new ones regarding the usual optional recurring nodes. There's also a reduction of conditional nodes. So that's quite an achievement in terms of simplification. And voila, that's it for quickly, sorry, but we only have 10 minutes, so I have to really go through very quickly on this. So basically, it's a relative success, this new directive in terms of simplification. We could have gone a bit further on other issues, but we are kind of satisfied with the final result. There was another point in this directive, which I will now mention quickly, which was the introduction of new transparency requirement for the extractive and logging industries. You may have heard of the new rules, so-called country-by-country reporting rules. So you will see in Chapter 10 of the new directive obligations for these firms, so the oil, mining, and forest industries, to report on an annual basis the payments they made to the government of those countries in which they are active. I can come back to this if you want at a later stage. So that's for the, let's say, next steps for the directive. So it was adopted in July 13. There are 2 years for the member states to transpose it, meaning turn them into their national legislation. So this is not directly applicable. And as Peter said, we expect first full application by companies at the latest in 2016. Okay? Since then, there has been a new proposal from the Commission on non-financial reporting. We also have a new directive there, but maybe I'll come back to this later. This is to increase transparency on companies regarding the impact of their activities on the environment, on social matters, and on the respect of human rights. That new provision is about to be published in the official journal on the EU and is going to be applicable in 2017. So I can also come back to this with more details. But to finish with a last words on this implementation process, because I think it's important to basically tell you a few words about what the reaction of the member states were to this new directive, and maybe also to tell you what the challenges they are facing now when turning this directive in their national law, because this is basically what we are busy doing at this moment with them. It's an EU directive, so it's adopted by the EU institution, but the national administrations have to turn them into national law, so this is why we are bringing them together at the moment. We have organized so-called transposition workshops, so we invite all administrations from the member states responsible for the implementation to tell us what their difficulties are, and we try to discuss together to exchange views and good practice, and also maybe exchange solutions if possible. This is a very useful and I would say effective exercise, but it already highlights some of the difficulties which they are going to face when transposing. For instance, there are some issues with the boundaries of the so-called small regime. So I said that we have a harmonized EU regime for small firms, which member states are supposed not to trespass, not to go beyond. But there are some issues regarding the actual scope and delimitation of that regime. There are also many questions regarding the new country-by-country requirement, to what kind of companies the situation it applies, where and how. And there are quite a lot of issues as well regarding the interaction of the accounting directive with other pieces of EU legislation, including the IS regulation, or the banking accounting directive, or the transparency directive. So we are trying to solve these issues together with our legal service and together with the member states. And there is also a member state who has challenged the validity of this directive before the Court of Justice because they were not happy with the way we have approached the idea of harmonizing the small regime. But this is a case which is pending before the court, so we'll see what the court will decide at the end of the day. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope I didn't take too much of your time, and I will, of course, I know it could be many questions, but I'd be happy to answer them at a later stage.